Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a time when people slept in ways that would make most of us squirm. No comfy, fluffy pillows or cozy blankets to sink into. No white noise machines to drown out the sound of traffic or the hum of a fan. You probably won't survive this, so buckle up. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start by stepping into the medieval world, where a good night's sleep was, well, a bit of a challenge. Imagine this. You're lying on a straw mattress, maybe with a thin woolen blanket to keep the cold at bay. The pillow? Yeah, that's not quite what you're used to. Instead of soft down or plush foam, you're probably resting your head on a small wooden block or just the hard floor. Not exactly a cloud-like experience, right? But here's the thing, people back then didn't really have much choice, and somehow they made do. Historians still argue whether they actually got better sleep despite all the discomfort. Was it a natural adaptation, or did they just not know any better? Either way, there's a certain ruggedness to it that we just don't have today. What's even more interesting is how that discomfort might have been a key part of their sleep experience. The simple fact is that medieval people didn't have all the distractions we do. They didn't have smartphones buzzing in the middle of the night or electric lights keeping them up late. Their lives were deeply tied to the rhythms of the sun, and when it went down, so did they. In fact, as soon as the sun set, most medieval people would prepare for sleep. There were no late-night television marathons or scrolling through Instagram. When darkness fell, it was time to rest. Sure, their sleep environment was primitive, but they didn't have the same stressors we deal with, so maybe, just maybe, their brains actually got the rest they needed. It's an open question, but something to ponder as we dive deeper into how medieval sleep worked. You might be surprised by what you find out. First off, let's talk about the beds, or the lack of them. You might be picturing a luxurious kingly canopy bed like in the fairy tales, but most medieval beds were far from luxurious. For the average peasant, it was more about survival than comfort. Imagine a pile of straw or hay stuffed into a cloth bag, probably tucked into a corner of a drafty, unheated room. That's your mattress for the night. The rich, on the other hand, had slightly more luxurious options, though they still weren't as cozy as modern beds. Their mattresses were usually filled with feathers or down, and sometimes with a bit of wool, though it's safe to say they weren't as supportive as today's memory foam. For everyone, the quality of the mattress was more about how much wealth or status you had. And don't even think about electric blankets. Instead, medieval sleepers had to rely on whatever heat they could muster. During the colder months, you might be lucky enough to sleep near a fireplace or stove, though that only provided warmth for a limited time. If you were truly unlucky, the chill of the night air would seep into your bones, making the already uncomfortable bedding feel even worse. It's hard to imagine a more miserable situation than being stuck in a cold stone building on a thin mattress in the dead of winter, but somehow, people survived it. In addition to bedding, most people didn't have what we consider the basics today: pillow, blanket, and sheets. The pillow was often a small wooden block or a rolled-up piece of fabric stuffed with some kind of filling. These blocks were designed to provide a little neck support, but the idea of sinking into a soft pillow after a long day, not even close. It wasn't until much later that more comfortable sleeping arrangements started to emerge for the elite, who could afford lavish silks and linens. But for the majority, sleeping was about function, not comfort. Yet despite these less than ideal conditions, sleep for medieval people might not have been as bad as we think. There's a theory known as segmented sleep that suggests medieval people didn't sleep the way we do today. Instead of a single, uninterrupted 8-hour block of sleep, they may have slept in 2 distinct shifts, the first sleep and the second sleep. You'd go to bed as soon as it got dark, wake up after a few hours, stay awake for a while, sometimes for an hour or two, before going back to sleep for a second stretch until dawn. Some historians think that people used this middle-of-the-night waking period for various activities, such as reading, chatting with a spouse, or even praying. It sounds a bit odd by modern standards, but it could have been a natural way to adapt to a life with less artificial lighting and no electric clocks to mark the hours. This idea of segmented sleep challenges the modern notion that we should be getting a continuous 8-hour stretch of rest. In fact, some studies today suggest that segmented sleep might actually be better for our bodies, especially when it comes to deep, restorative sleep. So maybe medieval people were onto something. As we dive deeper into the specifics of their nightly routines, we'll also touch on the health implications of their sleep conditions. Believe it or not, some historians believe that their roughing-it lifestyle may have led to healthier sleep patterns. Think about it. With no phones to check or Netflix to binge, medieval people likely got a deeper kind of rest. They were more in tune with their natural circadian rhythms, and perhaps that helped them sleep better than we do today, despite all the discomfort. Historians still argue whether this segmented sleep pattern was a widespread phenomenon or just something that happened in specific regions or classes. Some suggest that it was common in rural areas where people lived closer to nature and followed the sun's schedule more strictly, while others argue that it was a widespread practice across Europe. Regardless, it's a fascinating glimpse into how human sleep has evolved over the centuries, and how maybe, just maybe, modern sleep habits could stand to learn something from the past. With all that said, it's important to remember that medieval sleep wasn't exactly a walk in the park. We'll explore later how both the rich and the poor had their own struggles with sleep, sleeping arrangements, health risks, and even superstitions. But for now, let's keep this in mind. Despite the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements and lack of modern conveniences, medieval people were more in tune with the natural rhythms of their environment, and in a way, they may have had the best sleep in history, at least when you consider the absence of modern distractions. Now let's shift our focus from the what to the how of medieval sleep. You can imagine that people didn't just lay down and hope for the best. Oh no, they had entire systems in place for how they prepared for sleep, despite the lack of fancy bed frames or memory foam. The bedding setup was far from what we know today, but it was an essential part of the experience. For the rich and poor alike, the act of getting ready for bed was a bit of a ritual. The difference, however, lay in what they had available to them. For the common folk, the bed was often an unassuming affair. A simple straw-filled mattress or a pile of hay laid out on a rough wooden frame covered by a blanket or fur. That's about it. The mattress itself was often more about functionality than comfort. Most peasants lived in humble cottages with thatched roofs and stone walls, where keeping warm during the night was no easy task. Without central heating or space heaters, they had to make do with whatever warmth could be provided from a fireplace or stove in the main room. They might sleep near the fire, wrapped in whatever blankets or furs they had, with the fire's warmth slowly fading as the night went on. If you were particularly lucky, you might have a second blanket. If not, well, you would wake up shivering in the morning. Interestingly, historians argue that the straw mattresses, while uncomfortable by modern standards, might have offered some surprising benefits. For one, they could be easily replaced or refilled. Straw is naturally breathable, which kept the mattress relatively cool during the summer months. That said, the downside was that these mattresses were prone to becoming infested with pests, lice, fleas, and other critters that thrived in the warm, cozy environment of your bed. So while your mattress might have been natural, it was also crawling with tiny, unwelcome roommates. But hey, a little company never hurt anyone, right? For the wealthier classes, the bedding setup was unsurprisingly a bit more luxurious. Instead of straw-filled sacks, the rich used mattresses filled with feathers, down, or wool. Their beds were often elevated on wooden platforms, far from the dirt and cold of the floor. These elevated beds were considered a sign of status, as only those with wealth and access to resources could afford such comforts. And don't forget the canopy. A large fabric drapery was often hung around the bed for privacy, warmth, and to ward off drafts, as many of these beds were located near drafty windows or stone walls. The wealthy also had fine linens and cloths, sometimes made of the finest silks or velvets, depending on how much money you had. Sure, these beds were more comfortable than the straw-filled mattresses of the peasantry, but they weren't exactly what we'd consider a luxury by today's standards. Remember, no fluffy pillows, no soft sheets, just a slightly more refined version of the bed. But there's an important point to be made here. Despite the seeming discomfort of these medieval beds, they were crafted to fit the needs of the time. And one thing they certainly had going for them was simplicity. It's hard to imagine today, but the way these medieval beds were designed actually helped promote a deeper connection to the natural rhythms of sleep. People weren't surrounded by piles of pillows or blankets, leading to overstuffed, overcomfortable environments. Instead, they had to rely on what their bodies needed: comfort, warmth, and a good, deep rest. Without all the distractions of modern life, like artificial light and noise, sleep came more naturally, even on a bed of straw. The thing is, the bed setup wasn't the only factor influencing their sleep experience. The materials they used were in line with how they approached life in general. Everything had a purpose, and everything was meant to serve a need. From the materials for the mattresses to the type of bedding, there was an intentional effort to make the best of what they had. Even though these beds were far from luxurious by today's standards, they were designed for practicality and survival. In some ways, that may have led to better rest, at least compared to the constant distractions and overstimulation we deal with in the modern world. Of course, the act of preparing for bed wasn't just about the mattress. Medieval people had certain bedtime rituals that helped them wind down and prepare for sleep. Whether you were a wealthy noble or a humble peasant, you likely had some form of routine, even if it was as simple as washing up and saying a prayer before bed. For the elite, there was often a whole process of undressing, being pampered with oils, and slipping into fine nightclothes. Again, very different from what most of us experience today. But the fact is, no matter your class, getting a good night's sleep wasn't just about lying down and hoping for the best. It was about preparation, environment, and mental state. Another fascinating element to consider is how these routines would change with the seasons. Medieval people, like most of us, adapted their sleeping arrangements to fit the weather. In the winter, when the nights were longer and colder, it wasn't uncommon for people to sleep near the warmth of the fire, perhaps even lying on the floor closer to the heat source to maximize warmth. In the summer, when temperatures soared, people would likely opt for a lighter sleep setup, choosing thinner blankets, or sometimes sleeping without them altogether to keep cool. This constant adaptation to the changing environment meant that people were much more in tune with the natural rhythms of the world around them. Historians still argue whether these seasonal changes in sleeping habits had long-term health benefits. Could the natural fluctuation of sleeping temperature lead to better rest and improved immunity? Or did the constant exposure to cold drafts and pest-infested bedding lead to more health problems? The answers aren't clear, but what's certain is that medieval people knew how to adapt to their environment, and that adaptability likely shaped their sleep patterns in ways that we could learn from today. As we move forward, we'll explore even more of the fascinating ways medieval people's sleep habits were shaped by their environment. From the warm fireside retreats of the wealthy to the cold, cramped quarters of the peasants, sleep in the Middle Ages was far more than just a necessary function. It was deeply tied to the rhythm of life itself. Now let's take a closer look at what it was like to sleep in the towering stone walls of a castle. If you're picturing a beautiful four-poster bed draped with royal silks and velvet, you're not too far off, but it's a bit more complicated than that. In fact, even the rich didn't have the perfect sleep experience we might imagine. While they were certainly more comfortable than peasants, their bedchambers were still full of strange quirks and discomforts, all rooted in the realities of medieval life. If you were a noble or royal, your bed was likely to be placed in the upper part of a massive hall or in a separate chamber, sometimes draped with heavy tapestries or curtains for warmth and privacy. The room itself would likely be huge and cold, with stone walls that were difficult to heat. A fireplace in the corner would provide some warmth, but its effects were limited, and it's not as though they had central heating to ensure a warm and cozy night's rest. In fact, in the early Middle Ages, castles were often drafty, with no insulation to keep the warmth in. Sure, they had large, beautiful beds, but you were still battling the chill of the stone floors and walls. Your mattress, if you were lucky enough to have one, would have been stuffed with down feathers or wool, not unlike the mattresses of the wealthy in towns or villages. Still, it's worth noting that while these beds were probably soft by medieval standards, they were far from the modern comforts of memory foam. A royal sleep setup may have looked extravagant on the surface, but it still posed significant challenges. A royal bed, often elevated on a wooden platform to keep it away from drafts, was a sign of status, but the stone buildings, with their lack of effective heating, still left much to be desired when it came to comfort. Historians still argue whether the nobility's sleeping arrangements were significantly better than those of the peasantry. After all, while the wealthy may have had finer materials, the basic challenges of medieval sleeping arrangements, cold rooms, hard beds, and pests, affected all levels of society. It's interesting to think about the differences in quality of life, where a noble could afford to sleep in a nicer bed, but that didn't guarantee a better night's sleep. The wealthy often had several layers of blankets, furs, and coverings to stave off the cold, and their personal sleeping spaces would be outfitted with luxurious, embroidered bed linens. However, they also had to contend with the same environmental factors as everyone else: the cold, the noise of the household, and sometimes the presence of animals in the room. Castles, after all, were bustling centers of activity. The sound of footsteps in the corridors, the chatter of servants, and the movement of guards could easily interrupt a good night's rest. Plus, for many noble families, it was common to have family members, servants, and even animals sharing the same space, which created a much less peaceful sleep environment than we might imagine. Imagine sleeping soundly with your dogs curled at your feet, your servants rustling around in the dark, and maybe a few livestock animals nearby. It was all part of the medieval charm, or challenge, depending on your perspective. But there were also some fascinating practices that came with sleeping in a medieval castle that helped to create a unique kind of sleep culture. For instance, many noble families would sleep in a way that was more communal than what we might expect. At times, entire families or groups of trusted servants would sleep in the same chamber. This was partly for warmth, as it was far easier to share body heat in a large bed or near a fireplace, and partly for security. The medieval world wasn't exactly a safe place, especially for the upper classes who could be targeted by thieves or political enemies, so the presence of guards or servants in the same room ensured added protection. If someone broke in, there would be a much quicker response, even if it meant a bit of crowding. It provided both physical warmth and emotional comfort, especially during times of uncertainty. The shared sense of protection and familiarity helped everyone rest easier. In fact, many royal families followed this model well into the later centuries, where beds were built large enough for multiple people to sleep in. These family beds might sound strange, but when it was your only option for staying warm and safe, they made perfect sense. Interestingly, it wasn't just people who shared the bed with the wealthy. In some cases, animals were also invited to sleep nearby. Yes, you heard that right, animals in the bed. In colder regions, especially in places like Northern Europe, it wasn't uncommon for dogs, cats, and even livestock to be brought inside to sleep with their human owners. Not only did this provide additional warmth, but animals were also seen as part of the household, offering comfort and companionship. The idea of a pet sleeping in your bed might sound odd by today's standards, but in the medieval world, it was just another part of daily life. Historians still argue about the role of animals in medieval homes. Were they strictly for practical reasons, or did they provide real emotional comfort to their owners? It's hard to say. One thing is certain, though. The presence of animals in the room certainly made the sleep environment more dynamic and, perhaps, a bit more lively than the quiet, solitary sleep we tend to experience today. You can imagine a noblewoman lying down, ready to rest, only to have a cat leap onto the bed for warmth, or a dog curl up at her feet. It's a far cry from the sterile, quiet sleep environments most people have today. But, as strange as it may seem, medieval castle life had a rhythm all its own. It wasn't just about the mattress or the blankets. It was about how everything, sleep, family, animals, warmth, and security, intertwined in ways we no longer experience. People didn't have the luxury of a completely isolated sleep experience. Their sleep was communal, collaborative, and shaped by the practical needs of their time. While we may have a much different definition of what makes for a restful night, perhaps there was something calming about sharing a space with others who helped ensure your safety, even if it meant a little less privacy and a lot more noise. And as we continue to explore this medieval sleep culture, we'll see how the practice of communal sleep wasn't just for royalty. It was common across all social classes, though the reasons for it might have differed. Whether for warmth, protection, or simply because it was the norm of the time, medieval sleep was anything but solitary. It was an experience shaped by the people around you, the environment you lived in, and the resources available. As we venture further into the world of medieval sleep, let's take a closer look at the humble peasant's nightly routine. While the wealthy might have had their ornate castles and slightly more comfortable bedding, life for the peasantry was, as you can imagine, much less glamorous. In fact, the bed itself, what little of it they had, was more of a survival tool than a luxury. But despite the discomfort, there were elements of the peasant's sleep setup that were surprisingly efficient, considering the circumstances. Picture this: a tiny, dark cottage made of stone, clay, or wood. The floor is likely dirt, and the air smells of smoke from the hearth at the center of the room. If you're lucky, you have a simple straw-filled mattress, maybe even a thin woolen blanket, or a fur to keep warm. The mattress itself might be a sack filled with whatever was available: straw, hay, leaves, or even feathers if you could afford it. But these beds weren't luxurious by any stretch of the imagination. They were unyielding and hard, with very little cushion or support. So, if you were a peasant, you quickly learned how to sleep despite the discomfort. You didn't have the luxury of a fluffy pillow or thick mattress. Instead, you probably learned to make do, your body used to the rough surfaces and limited bedding. Historians still argue whether peasants actually slept worse than their noble counterparts, given that the latter were more likely to be troubled by social responsibilities and the demands of running an estate. Peasants, for all their hardships, may have been more attuned to natural rhythms, rising and sleeping with the sun. They had fewer distractions, no servants running around in the middle of the night, and no worries about the latest fashion or court politics. However, their bedding was, no surprise, much worse. But in some ways, that simplicity may have worked to their advantage. For one, their sleep schedule might have been more aligned with natural light, not interrupted by the endless stream of artificial distractions we face today. When the sun went down, so did they. There weren't late-night Netflix binges or the temptation to scroll through social media for hours. Instead, peasants might have gone to sleep soon after dusk, resting their heads as the moon rose high in the sky. Then, they'd wake with the first light of dawn, ready to start their day with whatever chores awaited them. This natural rhythm was something that the wealthier classes often struggled to maintain. With artificial lighting, social gatherings, and entertainment, noble families had a much harder time sticking to a natural sleep cycle. They might have stayed up late into the night, engaging in banquets, politics, or leisure activities, only to find themselves exhausted by the time morning came around. For peasants, sleep was more of a necessity than a luxury. Their bodies had to adapt to the harsh conditions, and as a result, they became incredibly attuned to the cycles of the day. But of course, there were still challenges. Life for peasants was hard, and their sleep was frequently interrupted. The cottage they lived in was often overcrowded, filled with family members, livestock, and sometimes guests. It wasn't unusual for a family of 5 or more to share a small room, with everyone sleeping in close quarters. And when you're packed like that, sleep becomes a bit of a communal affair. You'd probably fall asleep next to a sibling, a parent, or even a cow or sheep. In fact, some historians believe that medieval peasants often shared their sleeping space with their animals to stay warm. A cow or a sheep would provide much-needed warmth, especially during cold winters. Having animals in the bed might seem like a strange practice today, but in the medieval world, it was a matter of survival. People lived in close-knit environments where warmth and space were at a premium. And animals, whether they were providing warmth or companionship, became part of the daily routine. The fact is, a peasant's bed wasn't a place for rest and relaxation like we might think of today. It was a utilitarian space designed to keep them warm, safe, and functional for the next day's work. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of the sleeping arrangements that made rest difficult for peasants. Their homes were filled with noise too. In the quiet of the night, a creaking floorboard, the sound of footsteps outside, or the howling of wind through the cracks in the walls would keep even the most exhausted farmer alert. The constant noise of life could disrupt sleep, but for peasants, this was just part of their world. The noises weren't just unwelcome distractions, they were an integral part of their daily lives, adding a certain vibrancy to the silence of the night. And then, of course, there was the issue of pests. Straw-filled mattresses were not the best at keeping out critters, and they were a prime target for lice, fleas, and bedbugs. If you were lucky, your bedding was relatively pest-free, but it was just as likely that your mattress was crawling with unwanted guests, leaving you itching all night long. The thought of lying down on a bed full of bugs is enough to make anyone shudder, but for peasants, it was just part of life. They had to deal with the realities of their environment, which meant getting used to discomfort and learning to rest despite it. Still, it's worth considering whether the peasants' sleep had some unexpected advantages. Historians debate whether the stress and discomfort of peasant life led to poor sleep hygiene, or whether their natural, unencumbered schedules helped them get more restful sleep. Without modern distractions, artificial light, or the constant pressures of work and social obligations, peasants might have actually had an easier time achieving a deeper, more restorative form of sleep. The sheer simplicity of their environment, combined with their reliance on natural cycles, may have helped them sleep in ways that we no longer do today. One intriguing thought is that their fragmented, less interrupted sleep, broken by the sounds of the night, the movement of animals, and the rising of the sun, could have been healthier than the isolated, artificial sleep environments that we tend to create for ourselves today. When you sleep surrounded by people and animals, you're not just getting rest. You're part of a rhythm that keeps you in tune with nature and the world around you. It's something that many modern sleep experts believe we've lost, as we've isolated ourselves into quiet, sterile rooms where everything from the temperature to the noise is engineered for ideal conditions. In contrast, peasants likely experienced a more communal and, in some ways, more restorative sleep. So as we dig deeper into the medieval world, we can appreciate how the peasants' sleep, though rough and uncomfortable, might have been an essential part of the natural flow of their lives. Their beds may have been hard and their surroundings noisy, but in some strange way their sleep habits were more in tune with the natural world than ours are today. As we venture deeper into the medieval world of sleep, we can't ignore the most glaring and often underestimated aspect of medieval nights: the darkness. Unlike today, where streetlights, neon signs, and the glare of our phones keep us constantly bathed in light, medieval people lived in an environment where night meant true darkness. And let's be clear, it wasn't just any kind of darkness. It was pitch black, star-filled, full of mystery and potential dangers. Now, while that might sound a little unsettling to modern ears, it turns out that this deep, unrelenting darkness could have actually been a blessing for their sleep. You see, the absence of light at night was far more than just a passive occurrence. It was a signal, a cue for the body to rest, and more importantly, a signal for the brain to enter a state of relaxation. With no artificial lights pushing back the natural rhythms of sleep, medieval people had the opportunity to truly fall into a deep, undisturbed rest. There were no blinking clocks, no glowing screens, just the simple pull of sleep triggered by the natural darkness of the night. Historians still debate whether the complete absence of light during the medieval era helped or hindered sleep. Some argue that people were simply exhausted by the demands of their daily lives, and that sleep was more of a necessity than a luxury. But others believe that, like many of us today, medieval people benefited from this unbroken cycle of dark and light. Imagine how different it must have been to be tucked into bed after sundown, knowing that the night would unfold in silence and darkness without interruption. For those who lived during the Middle Ages, the darkness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was part of their sleep cycle. The beauty of this natural darkness is that it did something that many of us struggle with today. It helped regulate the body's circadian rhythm. Without artificial lights to mess with our sleep cycle, medieval people's brains could more easily sync with the rhythms of nature. They weren't battling the distraction of streetlights or smartphones. The body knew when it was time to sleep, and when the sun came up, it was time to wake up. This close relationship with the environment likely meant that they got more restorative rest, as the body didn't need to fight against artificial disruptions. But let's not romanticize it too much. The complete absence of light also meant that once the sun went down, it was really dark, dark enough to make anyone feel uneasy. The medieval world was full of shadows, of unseen noises, and yes, real dangers. Without streetlights to illuminate the path, traveling after dark could be a perilous endeavor. It's not hard to imagine how eerie and unsettling it must have been to sleep in a room where you couldn't even see your own hand in front of your face. Even in the relative safety of a castle or peasant hut, there was always the possibility of danger lurking in the shadows. So, while the complete darkness helped with sleep, it also came with its own set of fears. The dark was more than just a cue for the body to rest. It was a place of mystery and superstition. People in the Middle Ages often believed that the night was when spirits roamed, when witches cast their spells, and when demons lurked in the shadows. This superstition wasn't just something to pass the time, it was an ingrained part of life. People lived in fear of the night in ways we simply don't today. The darkness was both an invitation to sleep and a source of fear, a paradox that affected how people approached rest. For the peasants, living in dark, poorly lit homes, there was another element at play: privacy. Without electric lights, and with homes often shared by multiple people or families, privacy was nearly impossible. Imagine trying to sleep in a room filled with the sounds of your children, spouse, or maybe even your neighbor. The lack of privacy, coupled with the ever-present noise of the home, made sleep a communal experience, but not always in a peaceful way. While some may have found comfort in the presence of others, it could be incredibly difficult for others to sleep with so many people around. The constant proximity to others, family, animals, and sometimes guests, meant that your sleep was frequently interrupted by the sound of snoring, movement, or even the quiet shuffle of animals walking through the room. Historians still argue whether the lack of privacy was detrimental to sleep quality. Did being constantly surrounded by others improve rest due to the sense of warmth and protection? Or did it exacerbate sleep disruptions, leading to more restless nights? Some believe that, in many ways, the medieval practice of sharing sleeping spaces may have helped people feel more secure and relaxed, leading to better sleep. After all, the presence of others could offer emotional reassurance during a time when danger and uncertainty were constant. Then there were the other issues of the night. Medieval homes, especially those of peasants, were often filled with smoke. The fireplace, while providing much-needed warmth, also filled the room with smoke, which could cause discomfort or even respiratory issues. The air inside the home wasn't always the cleanest, and this smoky environment likely made for less than ideal sleeping conditions. Add to that the pervasive smell of animals, cows, pigs, chickens, and dogs sharing the same space. And it's clear that sleeping conditions weren't exactly pleasant by modern standards. Yet despite all of this, people slept. They adapted. They found ways to rest even in the most difficult of circumstances. Their sleep wasn't about luxury or perfection. It was about survival, comfort in the company of loved ones, and adapting to the rhythms of the earth. Without the distractions of modern technology and artificial lighting, they were more in tune with the natural world. Their sleep was rooted in the cycles of day and night, their bodies attuned to the rising and setting of the sun. And while their beds may have been hard, their surroundings noisy, and their nights full of shadows and uncertainties, medieval people managed to rest, and in some ways, perhaps, better than we do today. Historians still argue whether this natural darkness actually provided more restful sleep or whether it simply made people more susceptible to fear and superstition. Could our modern artificial lights be disrupting our sleep patterns in ways that medieval people didn't have to deal with? It's an open debate, but one worth considering as we continue exploring how our ancestors managed to sleep in a world much different from our own. Now, let's move on to something a bit more unusual. In the medieval world, sleep didn't just follow a straightforward single stretch through the night. No, in fact, medieval people practiced a rather peculiar sleep pattern. Segmented sleep, also known as biphasic sleep. If you're scratching your head right now wondering what that means, you're not alone. It's a fascinating piece of history that most of us have long forgotten. But in medieval times, it was completely normal to sleep in two distinct chunks, and this pattern might actually have been better for their overall health. Here's how it worked. Rather than going to bed at, say, 10 p.m. and staying asleep until 6 a.m., people would instead go to sleep soon after sundown. This was, after all, before electricity had been invented, so natural light was your only option. They'd fall into a deep first sleep, usually for about 4 hours, then wake up for a period of time in the middle of the night. This wasn't the time to toss and turn, lying awake in frustration. No, medieval people often spent that time doing useful things. Praying, reading, making love, or simply reflecting on the day. Some might even tend to household chores or personal tasks. The point is that they weren't lying awake in the dark, stressed about the time. This was considered a natural part of their rhythm. Historians still debate why segmented sleep was so widespread in the medieval world, with some arguing that it was simply a consequence of the lack of artificial light, while others claim that it was an entirely natural sleep cycle that people followed without any external disruptions. The idea of first sleep and second sleep is more than just a quirky historical tidbit. It actually might hold some scientific merit today. In modern times, research into sleep patterns has suggested that biphasic sleep might be more in line with the natural sleep rhythms our bodies have evolved to follow. In fact, in recent years, some sleep experts have looked to medieval sleep patterns to suggest that segmented sleep could lead to a more restful, restorative night's rest. The theory behind this is rooted in the fact that, when people wake up after their first sleep, they are likely to experience a burst of natural cortisol, a hormone that helps wake the body up and prepare for a second period of rest. So, essentially, by splitting their sleep into two parts, medieval people might have been getting better quality sleep than we do today with our constant, uninterrupted 7 to 8 hour sleep cycles. Think about it. Imagine the kind of restful sleep you could get if you didn't feel pressure to sleep through the entire night without interruption. In today's world, we often see waking up in the middle of the night as a sign of poor sleep hygiene, but back then it was a natural, well-accepted part of the cycle. People weren't stressing about their inability to sleep through the night. Instead, they were waking up, doing something productive or relaxing, and then going back to sleep feeling recharged and ready to finish their rest. Of course, this wasn't always a serene and peaceful affair. Waking up in the middle of the night, with the house completely dark and silent except for the occasional sounds of the wind or animals outside, could be unsettling. Even though medieval people accepted it as part of life, they likely had a bit of unease in that quiet, dark period of the night. It was a time for reflection, prayer, or perhaps even reading, activities that were vital for personal well-being, but could also have been emotionally or mentally exhausting. Some people might have used this time to engage in their spiritual rituals, reflecting on their dreams or praying to ward off any evil spirits that were believed to roam the night. But just as there were benefits to this fragmented sleep pattern, there were also some drawbacks. For one, it required a level of adaptability and routine. You had to be disciplined enough to fall back asleep after your first bout of wakefulness and not let your mind wander off into worries or distractions. For some, that might have been hard to manage, especially in an environment filled with noise and possible threats. The anxiety of living in a time when invasions, thieves, and political unrest were frequent meant that sleep was often disrupted by more than just natural waking. In addition, the lack of sleep regulation, no clocks, no reliable ways of tracking time, meant that people had to develop their own sense of when to get up and when to go back to bed. The ability to sleep in two separate phases required a deep familiarity with your body's natural rhythm, something that most people today might not be as attuned to. Still, the fact that people were able to make this system work is quite impressive. And even if it didn't always come with ideal circumstances, it's easy to see how a segmented sleep cycle could potentially have been more restful than the rigid, modern approach to continuous sleep. Interestingly, some historians believe that this segmented sleep pattern may have survived into the 17th century before it was slowly replaced by the modern, consolidated 8-hour stretch of sleep. Some modern-day sleepers, especially those struggling with insomnia, have found that revisiting this ancient practice of waking up in the middle of the night and then going back to sleep can actually help them feel more rested. Could it be that our modern one-size-fits-all sleep schedule is the real culprit behind our sleep troubles? Some sleep experts think that's exactly the case. Maybe the medieval world had it right all along, at least when it comes to sleep timing. So, as we look back at this fascinating piece of medieval sleep culture, we might find that there is a lot to learn from those who lived with these segmented sleep habits. Sure, they didn't have fluffy pillows, air conditioning, or warm beds, but their sleep routines were better aligned with their body's natural rhythms than most of us today. Whether or not we could adapt to this style of sleep in the modern world remains to be seen, but it's certainly an interesting concept to explore when we're considering how best to get that restful night's sleep we all crave. Now that we've explored the unique rhythms of medieval sleep, let's turn our attention to an aspect that often gets overlooked: How temperature, both heat and cold, shaped sleep patterns in the Middle Ages. As we all know, a warm bed and a cool room can make for a peaceful night's sleep, but in medieval times, controlling the temperature was a whole different challenge. Without the modern luxuries of central heating, air conditioning, or even a reliable fireplace, medieval people had to get creative to manage their environment. For the wealthy, the solution to temperature control was often as much about luxury as it was about practicality. Castles and manors were designed to accommodate the needs of their occupants, which included keeping them warm. Though these large stone structures could be drafty and cold, the nobility had some tricks up their sleeves. Rooms were often built around a central hearth, where fires could burn throughout the night. However, the warmth from these fires could only reach so far. The upper levels of a castle, where the sleeping quarters were, often felt colder than the lower levels. This meant that, no matter how grand the bed, you were still subject to the unpredictable temperatures of a stone structure. The bedding used by the wealthy, feathers, wool, furs, helped to combat this chill. Multiple blankets and thick tapestries were often draped over the beds to trap warmth, but no amount of plush fabric could fully shield you from the cold that seeped in through the stone walls and windows. It was a strange mix of comfort and discomfort, luxurious on the surface, but still vulnerable to the forces of nature. Historians still argue whether the wealthier classes actually slept better than peasants in terms of temperature regulation. Sure, the nobles had more blankets, better bedding, and more space, but they were also more likely to experience temperature extremes due to the drafty nature of castles. Peasants, on the other hand, while lacking in luxury, were often able to sleep more closely packed together, with bodies sharing warmth, and maybe even animals, too. In many ways, the peasants' sleep environments could have been warmer simply due to the intimacy of their sleeping arrangements. The more you crammed into a room, the more heat you generated. So, while the aristocracy might have had better bedding, peasants often had the advantage of shared warmth. Let's not forget the cold. Medieval homes, especially in rural areas, often lacked the insulation needed to keep heat in during the colder months. For the peasants, this meant they were exposed to chilly conditions, especially in the winter. Their homes, often one-room cottages with thatched roofs, weren't exactly airtight. Gaps in the walls and windows allowed drafts to enter, making it difficult to keep warm. At night, it wasn't uncommon for the temperature inside these homes to fall to near freezing levels. The bed might have been made of straw, which didn't offer much insulation, and the blankets could only do so much. In these homes, people might have resorted to sleeping in multiple layers of clothing, maybe even sleeping with their boots on if the cold was intense enough. The livestock, pigs, cows, chickens, would often be kept in the same room to keep warm. This provided not only a sense of security, but also a small measure of heat, as animals' body heat could make a noticeable difference in the cold. But even with the animals nearby, the peasants didn't have it easy. Their homes were exposed to the elements in ways that modern homes aren't. If there was a particularly harsh winter, they'd have to make do with what little warmth they had. Fireplaces in rural homes were often small, inefficient, and difficult to keep stoked through the night, especially when firewood was scarce. And let's not forget the issue of smoke. Poor ventilation in these cottages meant that smoke from the fire often filled the room, leading to not only uncomfortable conditions, but also potential health risks, such as lung problems. The air inside these homes was often thick with soot and smoke, making it difficult to breathe, let alone sleep soundly. On the other hand, this extreme cold might have had its benefits. With fewer distractions in the dead of winter, people could sleep more soundly, not necessarily because they were comfortable, but because they were simply exhausted from the cold and the hard work of the day. In a strange way, the harshness of the environment might have forced their bodies into deeper, more restorative sleep. There were fewer artificial light sources to mess with their circadian rhythms, and the cold could have helped them settle into sleep earlier than they might have otherwise. But what about the heat? Medieval people had to contend with that too. During the summer months, when temperatures soared, there was very little they could do to cool off. Castles and manor houses, with their thick stone walls, could be stifling during the warmer months. The heat would seep in through the walls and linger in the rooms long after the sun had set. If you were a noble, you might have had the luxury of larger windows or the ability to sleep near a cooler, lower floor. But that didn't mean it was comfortable. Without modern cooling methods, the heat could be unbearable. Peasants, of course, didn't have the luxury of elevated beds or strategically placed windows. Their homes were low to the ground, which meant that they were often hotter than the upper chambers of the castles. It wasn't uncommon for peasants to sleep outside or in the fields during heat waves, simply to avoid the stifling heat inside their homes. The lack of proper ventilation in their cottages would make the air thick and oppressive, especially in regions where the heat didn't let up at night. At the height of summer, there wasn't much relief, and people had to make do by sleeping with as few coverings as possible, trying to sleep through the sticky heat that seemed to cling to the skin. Yet, in a world where temperature regulation was so difficult, people found ways to adapt. The cold and heat were natural forces they had to live with, but the practices they developed in response to these challenges likely influenced how they slept, and how well they slept. Whether it was through sharing warmth with family and animals or piling on blankets to keep warm, the act of sleep in the medieval world was as much about survival as it was about rest. Historians still debate whether the lack of temperature control in medieval sleep environments made people more resilient, or whether it created an ongoing struggle for rest. Could the daily grind of adjusting to extreme temperatures actually have led to better sleep habits, or did it make sleep more of a challenge than it needed to be? It's hard to say, but it's clear that medieval people were far more attuned to the natural elements than we are today. They had no choice but to adapt, and in doing so, they might have achieved a different, possibly even more restful sleep pattern than what we experience now. We've covered some unique aspects of medieval sleep: darkness, the segmented sleep cycle, and the challenges of temperature regulation. But one of the most fascinating parts of the medieval sleep experience is the fact that people didn't sleep alone. In fact, sleeping with others was the norm across nearly all social classes, and it was a practice that influenced how people rested in ways we might not expect. Whether it was family members, servants, or even animals, medieval sleep was inherently communal. For the wealthy, communal sleep wasn't necessarily about proximity or lack of space. It was about protection, warmth, and sometimes privacy. Castles and manors were large and often filled with the hustle and bustle of servants, guards, and visitors. The nobles' chambers weren't solitary retreats like we might imagine today. Instead, family members, servants, and sometimes even friends shared the same sleeping quarters, or at the very least, shared the same room. In some cases, entire families might sleep in one bed or a series of beds placed together to maximize warmth. With the cold drafts of a castle and the uncertainty of medieval life, having loved ones and trusted servants nearby was essential. In some medieval castles, the larger beds were designed to accommodate multiple people. And, while it might seem strange to us today, having several family members sleeping together wasn't necessarily viewed as uncomfortable or weird. In fact, many historians argue that it provided a sense of safety and emotional security. When you're in a large, dark stone building, where the night brings uncertainty and sometimes even danger, the presence of others, be they family, servants, or animals, provided comfort. On the other hand, the presence of animals in noble households may seem even stranger to us. In medieval times, animals were more than just pets. They were often treated as part of the family and in many cases slept in the same room as their owners. Cats and dogs particularly were often invited to share the bed for warmth and companionship. This practice, though odd by modern standards, was not only practical, but also seen as comforting. With the cold temperatures of the stone buildings and the risk of vermin, having animals around was a natural solution. Imagine curling up for a night's sleep with a warm, furry animal at your feet or even beside you under the blanket. It might not have been the peaceful, solitary sleep experience we're accustomed to, but it offered a kind of comfort, both emotional and physical, that modern people might miss out on in our more isolated sleep environments. For peasants, communal sleep was even more integral. In fact, it wasn't unusual for multiple people, parents, children, and sometimes extended family, to share a bed, or at least the same sleeping area. In the humble cottages where peasants lived, space was at a premium, and the warmth of multiple bodies was a survival necessity. Sleeping near each other allowed them to stay warm during the cold nights, especially in winter, when the temperature inside the home could drop drastically. With the presence of livestock too, the warmth from the animals added another layer of comfort. The cattle and sheep, often kept indoors during colder months, were part of the nightly routine, helping to keep the sleeping space warm enough to make it through the night. There's an undeniable intimacy to this shared sleep experience. In some ways, it's hard to imagine the modern, private sleeping arrangements we have today, where even the thought of someone else in our bed can be a huge disruption. But for medieval people, communal sleeping wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a necessity for warmth, safety, and even emotional well-being. The absence of personal space, while foreign to us today, had a rhythm all its own. For peasants, it wasn't just a social practice, it was a way of life. Having loved ones or even animals nearby as you drifted off to sleep was a form of security that helped people feel safe in an otherwise dangerous and uncertain world. Historians still debate how much this communal sleeping affected the quality of rest. Was it more restful to sleep near others, or did the constant closeness lead to poor sleep quality due to noise, movement, and lack of privacy? There's no clear answer. Some scholars argue that while the physical closeness of family members and animals offered warmth and security, it could have also resulted in interrupted sleep. Constant noise, snoring, rustling, and even the sounds of animals moving about could have disturbed sleep. On the other hand, some historians argue that this communal aspect helped strengthen bonds and reduced the anxiety of being alone. It's also possible that the shared warmth, the emotional comfort of being surrounded by loved ones, helped people feel more rested, despite the interruptions. Interestingly, this communal sleeping wasn't just confined to family members or servants. It was not uncommon for villages to have communal sleeping arrangements, where whole families or entire households would sleep together in a shared space. People didn't have the luxury of personal rooms or separate beds. Instead, they slept side by side, forming close-knit communities where privacy was a rare commodity. This communal sleeping didn't necessarily equate to better sleep quality, but it certainly affected how medieval people approached rest. One of the biggest challenges to communal sleeping, of course, was the presence of animals. While having dogs, cats, and even livestock in the same space may have provided warmth and protection, it also created its own set of issues. Sleeping next to animals came with a whole host of hygiene concerns. While animals helped keep the space warm, they also brought fleas, ticks, and other pests into the bed. These pests were a major nuisance for medieval sleepers, especially since their bedding was made of straw or other materials that were perfect homes for parasites. While people back then were likely more accustomed to these conditions, it's not hard to imagine how uncomfortable it must have been to sleep in a room full of both people and animals. Still, this communal sleeping setup, despite the pests, the noise, and the lack of privacy, was an essential part of the medieval world. It fostered closeness, provided warmth, and helped people survive in a world without modern comforts. And in some ways, there's something comforting about the idea of sharing a space with others, sleeping in a shared rhythm, surrounded by the warmth of family and animals. In our modern world, we've become so accustomed to sleeping alone, in our own private, controlled spaces, that it's easy to forget the benefits of this communal experience. Historians continue to debate whether the communal nature of medieval sleep was healthier or more restful than the isolated sleep we experience today. But one thing is for sure, medieval sleep was much more interconnected with the world around people. Their sleep was a social act, a survival strategy, and an essential part of their day-to-day existence. Whether they were sleeping with family, servants, or animals, the act of sleep was as communal as everything else in their lives. As we move forward in our exploration of medieval sleep, it's time to tackle something that might seem a bit out of place in a discussion of rest: the role of dreams. In the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just about rest. It was often thought to be a time when the spirit could travel, receive messages, or be visited by supernatural forces. Dreams were regarded as powerful, meaningful, and in many cases, downright spiritual. They played a significant role in how medieval people approached their sleep, influencing both their nighttime rituals and their waking thoughts. For one, the medieval mind didn't see sleep as simply a necessary biological function. Instead, it was considered a gateway to another realm, one where the soul could wander and interact with divine or supernatural forces. Dreams were often seen as messages from God, angels, or demons, depending on their nature. Religious figures, particularly monks and priests, would often interpret dreams, offering explanations or warnings to those who sought guidance. A disturbing dream could be seen as a sign of spiritual danger, while a pleasant or prophetic one might be interpreted as a blessing. Historians still argue about the significance medieval people placed on dreams. While it's clear that dreams were taken seriously, there's a debate over whether people truly believed in the supernatural aspects of dreams, or if they were more metaphorical in their approach. Some argue that dreams were used as a way to explain the inexplicable, offering comfort or understanding in times of uncertainty. After all, the Middle Ages were a time of hardship, disease, and often violent upheaval. If dreams were a way to make sense of the chaos of daily life, it makes sense that they would be taken seriously. For the wealthy, dreams could be particularly significant. If you were a noble, dreams were not only a reflection of your personal life, but could also be seen as a sign of divine favor or disfavor. Kings and queens especially would often seek interpretations of their dreams to gain insight into their rule or the future of their kingdom. Prophetic dreams were believed to have special power, and many medieval leaders saw them as omens that could influence decisions or guide them through crises. In fact, there are several well-documented cases of monarchs consulting with dream interpreters before making major decisions, convinced that their dreams were divinely inspired. On the flip side, for the peasantry, dreams were often a reflection of more immediate concerns: hunger, fear, or the uncertainty of daily life. Dreams about crops failing, disease spreading, or family members falling ill were interpreted as warnings to be vigilant or take action. Like the nobles, peasants often looked to dreams for meaning, but the interpretation was usually grounded in the harsh realities of their world. If a peasant had a dream of a sick child, for example, it might be seen as a sign to seek a healer or take extra precautions to protect the family. In a time when survival was never guaranteed, a dream could be a source of guidance, or at least a way to rationalize a difficult situation. But beyond just interpreting dreams, medieval people had a whole host of nighttime rituals designed to ensure that they would sleep well and protect themselves from any potentially harmful dreams. One popular practice was the use of amulets or charms, small objects worn or placed under the pillow to ward off evil spirits or prevent bad dreams. These charms were often infused with religious or magical significance. Some might have been blessed by a priest, while others were considered to have protective powers based on ancient beliefs. People also used herbs like lavender or rosemary, known for their calming properties, to create sachets or pillows that were thought to help with sleep and prevent nightmares. Religious practices were also important when it came to sleep. Before going to bed, many people, whether noble or peasant, would say prayers or perform rituals to seek protection during the night. The Compline prayer, which was often recited before sleep, asked for God's protection through the darkness of the night. People believed that praying before sleep not only offered spiritual protection but also helped ensure that their dreams were favorable or free from evil influences. In some cases, people would sleep with religious icons or symbols near them, believing that these objects would protect them from bad dreams or harmful spiritual encounters. Interestingly, the role of dreams in medieval culture wasn't just religious, it was also deeply tied to the natural world. In a society that was closely linked to nature, dreams often reflected the rhythms of the seasons, the cycles of life, and the changing of the land. A dream of a bountiful harvest could be seen as a positive omen, while a dream of a storm or flood might reflect worries about crop failure. Dreams, then, served not just as spiritual guidance, but as a way of interpreting the natural world and the forces of nature that medieval people had little control over. Historians still debate whether medieval people's reliance on dreams as a guide for action was a sign of superstition, or whether it provided a useful framework for understanding the world. On one hand, dreams provided comfort and explanation in a time when so much was uncertain. On the other, they may have led people to take unnecessary precautions based on misinterpretations. But one thing is clear: dreams were far more than just random occurrences to medieval people. They were a bridge between the waking world and the unknown, a realm where they could seek guidance, reflect on their lives, and interpret the mysteries of the universe. This medieval fascination with dreams shows how deeply connected sleep was to both the spiritual and natural realms. It wasn't just a time for the body to rest. It was a time for the soul to wander, to seek answers, and to make sense of the chaos of life. It's easy to see how this perception of sleep and dreams could have shaped the way people rested. Sleep wasn't simply an act of physical recuperation, but a deeply ingrained part of their worldview. In the end, medieval people didn't just sleep to rest. They slept to understand, to reflect, and to connect with something greater than themselves. As we continue to unravel the medieval sleep experience, it's impossible to ignore the ways in which noise shaped the quality of rest. We've talked about darkness, temperature, communal sleeping, and even the spiritual nature of dreams. But in the medieval world, sleep wasn't just influenced by the absence of light or the cold stone of a castle. The sounds of the night played a huge role, and sometimes they weren't the quiet, peaceful sounds we associate with sleep today. Instead, the medieval night was filled with a symphony of sounds that could either lull you into slumber or disrupt it entirely. Let's start with the sounds that might have helped medieval people sleep. In the quieter rural areas, the sounds of nature would have been ever present. Wind rustling through the trees, the croaking of frogs, the chirping of insects, or the gentle bleating of sheep in the distance. These natural sounds could have been soothing, creating a rhythmic lullaby that encouraged rest. In a time before the constant hum of modern cities or the white noise of electronic devices, the ambient noise of nature likely became an integral part of the sleep environment. For medieval people, these sounds were familiar, even comforting, and would have been woven into the very fabric of their sleep. Historians still debate whether these natural sounds helped or hindered sleep. On the one hand, nature's symphony could have provided a soothing background noise, helping people drift off into deeper, more restorative sleep. On the other hand, the unpredictability of these sounds might have kept some people on edge. A rustling in the trees might be the wind, or it might be an animal lurking nearby. The calls of nocturnal creatures could have been unsettling, especially when you're trying to rest in a time where predators, thieves, and other dangers were ever present. So, while nature's sounds might have created a sense of tranquility, they also carried an undercurrent of risk. But there was more to the medieval night than just the sounds of nature. For people living in towns and cities, noise was an ever-present part of life, even during the night. Castles, monasteries, and even small towns were bustling places, and the sounds of activity didn't stop just because the sun set. Medieval towns were filled with the noise of people coming and going, shouting, laughter, the clinking of tools, the clatter of horses' hooves, and the creaking of wooden carts. These sounds, though they may have seemed normal at the time, were a far cry from the peaceful stillness we associate with sleep today. And it wasn't just the sounds of the people that filled the night. Medieval life was also filled with the sounds of animals, dogs barking, horses neighing, livestock moving about. If you were a peasant, you might have had pigs, chickens, or even cows in your home. These animals, while providing warmth and security, also made their own noises. The constant chatter of chickens or the bleating of a goat could easily disrupt sleep, especially if you were sharing a bed with them. But for medieval people, this kind of noise was simply a part of life. It wasn't something that kept them awake in frustration, but rather something they adapted to. Yet, despite the sounds of nature and animals, the real disruptive noises often came from the people themselves. Medieval households, whether noble or peasant, were rarely quiet. Servants, family members, and guests would frequently come and go, especially in noble households where social gatherings could stretch late into the night. Even in a relatively modest home, the movement of family members during the night could disturb sleep. People woke up early, often before the crack of dawn, to begin their daily chores, and this early activity would stir others awake as well. Then there were the sounds of danger. Medieval society was anything but peaceful, and the risk of attack, robbery, or violence was always on the horizon. Nighttime was particularly vulnerable to danger, as many medieval towns lacked proper security measures, and people were more exposed to thieves, invaders, or wild animals. The noise of a night watchman's footsteps, the clanging of gates being shut, or the cries of fire or attack were terrifying sounds that would have sent anyone's heart racing. For those living in a castle or a fortified city, this sense of danger might have been even more pronounced. The constant watch over the perimeter of the castle, the sounds of guards and sentries calling out to one another, would have created an atmosphere of heightened vigilance. These noises might have been comforting in a way. They signaled safety and alertness, but they could also make it difficult to fully relax and sleep soundly. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of these night noises. On the one hand, some believe that the constant noise would have kept people in a heightened state of alertness, disrupting sleep. After all, a deep, uninterrupted slumber would have been a luxury when there was always something happening, whether it was the wind rustling through trees, the noise of animals, or the shuffling of people going about their business. On the other hand, some argue that people in the medieval world were simply accustomed to the noise and would have adapted, developing a tolerance for it. Perhaps, for medieval people, these noises became part of the comforting rhythms of life, just as the sounds of nature might have been. Interestingly, the level of noise could have varied dramatically depending on where you lived. In rural areas, the noise was likely to be minimal, just the sounds of animals, the wind, and perhaps the occasional chatter of family members. But in towns or cities, noise could have been overwhelming, with the constant hum of human activity and the occasional disruptions of the night. In castles and monasteries, the noise levels would vary depending on the purpose of the building. A castle, filled with guards, servants, and family members, was likely full of activity throughout the night, while a monastery might have been quieter, with monks engaged in prayer or contemplation, contributing to a much more subdued nighttime environment. So, whether you lived in the country, the city, or a castle, noise played a significant role in how medieval people slept. The sounds of nature, the bustle of human activity, and the ever-present threat of danger all shaped the sleep environment. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of noise-canceling headphones or earplugs. They slept through the sounds of the world around them, learning to tune them out, or, in some cases, using them as part of their nightly rhythm. Today, we might find these noises disruptive, but for medieval people, they were just part of the experience of sleep. Ultimately, the sounds of the medieval night, whether they were soothing or unsettling, show us just how different sleep was in the past. The very absence of silence was an integral part of the experience, and medieval people, for all the challenges they faced, found ways to adapt. And maybe, in a world where quiet has become a rare commodity, there's something we can learn from their resilience. Now that we've explored the sounds, the communal nature of sleep, and the fascinating role dreams played in medieval lives, it's time to delve into something a little less comforting: the hygiene, or lack thereof, that accompanied medieval sleep. While today's sleep environments are often defined by comfort, cleanliness, and modern amenities, medieval people didn't exactly have access to the kind of sanitation we take for granted. In fact, hygiene practices were so rudimentary that they might make your skin crawl. But despite this, people still managed to sleep, adapt, and, believe it or not, get the rest they needed. First, let's address the obvious. Medieval beds were, to put it simply, breeding grounds for germs and pests. Whether you were a noble or a peasant, your bedding was likely home to a variety of unwanted creatures. Peasants, with their straw-filled mattresses, often had the worst of it. These mattresses were perfect homes for fleas, lice, and bedbugs, which thrived in the warm, damp conditions of the bedding. And while people might have been able to shake out their bedding or replace the straw occasionally, it wasn't enough to prevent these pesky creatures from infesting their sleep space. The idea of a peaceful, itch-free night was virtually impossible for the lower classes. For the wealthy, the situation wasn't much better. Though the materials used in their bedding were different, noble households used feather-filled or wool-stuffed mattresses, but these too could harbor insects and pests. The bedding, while perhaps more luxurious in texture, didn't come with any sort of protection from the parasites that were common in medieval life. The rich might have had a bit more comfort when it came to the softness of their beds, but they still dealt with the same problems of cleanliness and hygiene. Historians still argue about how medieval people coped with these infestations. Some believe that people were simply more accustomed to living with insects and dirt, and therefore didn't view it as problematic. Others suggest that, for many, these pests were a constant nuisance, but something they had no choice but to endure. It's worth noting that people didn't understand the role of hygiene and cleanliness in health the way we do today. The concept of germs and disease transmission was still centuries away from being fully understood. So, in a sense, people simply lived with the conditions they had, never realizing the extent to which their environment contributed to health problems. One of the reasons for the lack of sanitation was that bathing was a luxury, especially for the common folk. Medieval people didn't bathe nearly as often as we do today. In fact, regular bathing was considered unnecessary in many parts of Europe during the Middle Ages, and in some places it was even frowned upon. The prevailing belief was that water could carry diseases, so people avoided bathing for fear of illness. Instead, people might have relied on dry cleaning methods like rubbing their bodies with cloths, scraping off dirt with a knife, or using powders or perfumes to mask the smell. But while these practices might have kept the worst of the dirt at bay, they certainly didn't help with basic hygiene. It wasn't until the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance that bathing became more common again, and by that point, it was often done in communal bathhouses, which, while social, were notorious for spreading diseases like the plague. The wealthy had a slight advantage when it came to hygiene, but not by much. They might have had access to private baths or been able to afford better hygiene products, but bathing wasn't exactly a daily activity. And while they could afford to change their clothes more frequently, even their clothing and linens weren't always kept clean by modern standards. Fabrics like wool and linen were often heavy, and washing them required a significant amount of effort, so they weren't cleaned regularly. This lack of cleanliness wasn't necessarily seen as a major problem for the people of the time. It was just part of life. Personal hygiene practices were simply not as advanced as what we expect today. Interestingly, some historians argue that medieval people's lack of hygiene might not have been as harmful as we might think. Without the modern conveniences of soap, water, and deodorants, they developed a level of tolerance to the dirt, lice, and other environmental factors. Their immune systems, always exposed to various germs and infections, might have been stronger as a result. The question, however, remains open. Did this lack of hygiene make medieval people more resilient, or did it just lead to more widespread illness and discomfort? While it's difficult to say for certain, we do know that medieval people didn't have the same fears of dirt and germs that we do today. For them, it was just part of daily life. And yet, despite these incredibly uncomfortable conditions, people still managed to sleep. The cold, the dirt, the pests, the noise, it didn't stop people from resting, even if their sleep was less than ideal. In fact, medieval people likely adapted to these circumstances in ways we can't fully comprehend. Their bodies became accustomed to the discomforts of the day, and their sleep cycles adapted to their environment. They didn't have the luxury of sanitized bedding, hot showers, or pest-free mattresses. But they had something perhaps even more important, a rhythm of life that allowed them to get the rest they needed, despite the conditions. Of course, the lack of hygiene didn't only affect sleep. It affected all aspects of life in the medieval world, from food preparation to personal interactions. But when it came to sleep, the lack of cleanliness created an environment where comfort was secondary to survival. People slept through discomfort, learned to tolerate it, and adapted to the realities of their time. Historians still debate whether medieval people truly slept better, or if they just learned to cope with the uncomfortable conditions of their world. Could their immune systems have been stronger because of the constant exposure to dirt, pests, and cold? Or did their lack of hygiene contribute to more widespread disease and illness? These questions remain unanswered. But one thing is clear. Despite the lack of sanitation, medieval people's sleep was incredibly resilient, and they found ways to rest, recover, and adapt. Ultimately, the lack of hygiene and cleanliness is a stark reminder of just how different the medieval world was from ours. Today, we have the luxury of soft, clean bedding, climate-controlled rooms, and sanitation standards that ensure we can sleep without the risk of infestation. But back then, medieval people found ways to adapt, and they slept in an environment that required resilience, creativity, and a deep connection to the rhythms of their world. Having covered the challenges of hygiene, pests, and communal sleep, let's now explore another integral part of the medieval sleep experience: superstitions. In a world where knowledge about health, sleep, and dreams was limited, it's no surprise that medieval people turned to beliefs and rituals to help them sleep more soundly. or to protect themselves from the things that might disrupt their rest. The medieval night was filled with fears and uncertainties, and to ward off evil spirits or bad dreams, people developed a rich tapestry of superstitions, beliefs, and practices. One of the most common superstitions surrounding sleep in the Middle Ages was the belief in night spirits, demons, and supernatural forces. These entities were thought to roam the earth at night, seeking to possess or harm the unsuspecting sleeper. It wasn't uncommon for people to sleep with an amulet or charm, believing that it would protect them from these evil forces. Some of these charms were blessed by priests, while others were thought to be enchanted with special powers that could ward off malicious spirits. People also believed that certain herbs, such as rosemary, lavender, and sage, could act as protective barriers, helping them sleep undisturbed by supernatural forces. These superstitions often extended to the act of sleeping itself. Some medieval people believed that the way you slept could influence your dreams, or even your fate. For example, sleeping with your head facing north was thought to invite bad dreams, while sleeping with your head facing east was considered to bring good fortune. In fact, the placement of the bed was often just as important as the actual sleep environment. People might have arranged their beds according to astrological advice, following specific alignments to ensure that their sleep was protected from negative energies. This belief in the power of direction and placement wasn't limited to the rich. Even peasants would sometimes place their beds in certain positions to attract good fortune and ensure peaceful sleep. Beyond this, there were many more rituals and practices that people engaged in to protect their sleep. One common practice was the use of a night watch in homes and castles. While this may have had a practical function, keeping the household safe from intruders or fires, it was also deeply tied to the superstition that spirits and demons were more active during the night. In castles and manors, a guard might have been stationed outside the master's chambers, not just to prevent a thief from entering, but to ensure that any nighttime malevolent forces were kept at bay. Sleep disruptions were often seen as a sign of spiritual imbalance, and people believed that certain activities or objects could trigger these disturbances. For instance, the belief that a mirror in a bedroom could cause bad dreams was widespread. It was thought that mirrors allowed spirits to enter the room, as they were considered portals to the supernatural realm. Similarly, some medieval people believed that certain sounds, like the ringing of a bell or the howling of a dog, were signs of impending doom or spiritual danger. This heightened sensitivity to the environment led people to develop elaborate rituals and precautions to safeguard themselves while they slept. Another common superstition was the fear of the night hag, or nightmare, a spirit that was believed to sit on the chest of a sleeping person, causing them to experience suffocating sensations and terrifying dreams. The word nightmare itself comes from this belief, as it was thought that the hag would straddle the sleeper and create a sense of pressure, making it difficult to breathe or move. In medieval folklore, the night hag was a symbol of both spiritual and physical oppression, and her presence was often interpreted as a sign of something wrong with the person's soul or life. To prevent the night hag from visiting, people would often sleep with certain protections, such as hanging herbs by the bed, placing an object like a knife or iron near their pillow, or even reciting prayers before bed. In addition to these superstitions about spirits, there were also beliefs about the dangers of sleep itself. Some medieval people believed that the act of sleeping left the soul vulnerable to evil influences, and that those who slept too deeply or for too long might risk losing their soul to demons or dark forces. This belief may have been tied to the medieval understanding of sleep as a time when the body and soul were not fully in control. As a result, sleep was often treated with a level of caution and suspicion. Some people might have even avoided sleeping for extended periods, believing that too much sleep could invite these negative forces into their lives. Interestingly, certain times of day and the moon's phases were believed to affect sleep quality as well. For example, it was common for people to avoid sleeping during a full moon, as it was thought to make them more vulnerable to spiritual attack. The moon, with its mysterious and fluctuating phases, was often linked to the supernatural, and its presence in the night sky was seen as a powerful influence on one's sleep. Similarly, people would sometimes try to time their sleep with the lunar cycle, using the moon's phases as a guide for when to rest and when to stay awake. While these superstitions were widespread in medieval times, they weren't limited to rural or uneducated populations. Even among the educated elite, belief in the supernatural was common. Monks and scholars, for instance, would often seek out spiritual guidance or prayers before sleep, believing that their dreams could be prophetic or reveal hidden truths. The medieval church played a significant role in shaping how people approached sleep. For many, sleep was a deeply spiritual act, one that required protection, prayers, and rituals to ensure peace and safety. Historians still debate how much medieval people genuinely believed in these superstitions versus how much they simply adopted them as cultural practices. Some believe that the rituals surrounding sleep were more about providing psychological comfort in an unpredictable world, while others suggest that the spiritual and supernatural elements were deeply intertwined with the everyday lives of medieval people. Whatever the case, it's clear that sleep was never just about resting. It was a time of spiritual reflection, protection, and vulnerability. As we move into the later Middle Ages and beyond, many of these superstitions began to wane, replaced by new ideas about sleep and health. But even as modern medicine advanced, echoes of these beliefs remained in folklore and culture, reminding us that, for much of human history, sleep was seen as far more than just a physical necessity. It was an encounter with the unknown, a time when the boundaries between the waking world and the supernatural were blurred. As we've seen, the medieval approach to sleep was deeply intertwined with superstition, spirituality, and the constant need for protection against the unknown. But beyond the mystical and the supernatural, one of the most influential factors shaping how people slept during the Middle Ages was religion. The Church in particular held significant sway over nearly every aspect of daily life, and sleep was no exception. The practices, beliefs, and rules surrounding sleep were often shaped by religious teachings and rituals, which made sleep not just a physical need, but a spiritual act. One of the most important religious influences on sleep was the concept of Compline, a prayer that was traditionally recited before sleep. This prayer was part of the divine office, the liturgical practice of the Church, and was said before retiring for the night. The purpose of Compline was to offer protection during the hours of darkness, a time when evil spirits were believed to be most active. The prayer asked for God's mercy, peace, and a peaceful night's sleep, as well as protection from dangers such as nightmares or possession by demons. It wasn't just a calming ritual. It was a way to spiritually prepare for the vulnerability of sleep, ensuring that the soul was at peace before entering the realm of dreams. The importance of prayer before bed was emphasized not just by monks and clergy, but by ordinary people too. In the medieval world, the act of sleeping was seen as a time when the soul could be exposed to external influences, both good and bad. A common practice was to say a prayer for divine protection or to invoke the names of saints before lying down. This wasn't simply to aid in sleep, but to safeguard the soul, ensuring it wouldn't be disturbed by negative spiritual forces during the night. People believed that by calling upon God or the saints, they could prevent evil spirits from interfering with their rest. In some ways, religious teachings around sleep reinforced the sense of the night being a time of spiritual importance. The medieval church taught that the night was a time of rest, yes, but also a time to reconnect with God. Sleep was seen as a temporary death, a peaceful temporary separation of the soul from the body. And so, just as one would pray for God's protection during waking hours, the same was done before sleep. For the devout, sleep wasn't merely about rejuvenation. It was also a part of a sacred rhythm, a time when they could experience rest as a reflection of God's grace. The Church's teachings on sleep were also a reflection of broader ideas about human nature and the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds. Medieval Christians believed that the body, while earthly, was a temple for the soul, and rest was necessary to maintain the body's strength for carrying out God's work. The practice of Compline and other bedtime rituals were an acknowledgement that sleep was a spiritual as well as a physical need. Sleep wasn't just for relaxation or rejuvenation. It was a time to reconnect with God, to prepare for the day ahead, and to ensure the soul's well-being. For those living in monasteries or convents, the religious influence on sleep was even more pronounced. Monastic communities followed strict schedules of prayer and work, with sleep being strictly regimented to ensure that the body and mind were properly rested to perform religious duties. Sleep in these communities wasn't seen as a luxury, but as an essential part of spiritual discipline. The monks and nuns would sleep in communal dormitories, each bed separated by a small partition, but always within earshot of one another. The quiet of the night, broken only by the sounds of soft prayers and the occasional creak of wooden floors, helped reinforce the idea that sleep was a time for spiritual renewal. In fact, many monastic orders had a set amount of sleep time, often just a few hours, followed by a rigorous schedule of prayer and work. Historians still debate how much medieval people truly understood the concept of sleep in the way we do today. In many ways, they did not have the scientific knowledge we now have regarding the body's needs for rest, but their deep spirituality and belief in the connection between the body and the soul influenced how they approached sleep. To them, it wasn't just a biological function, it was a crucial part of their spiritual life. Sleep was an act of faith, a trust that God would protect them through the darkness of the night. Religious practices surrounding sleep didn't just include prayer, they also influenced the very structure of medieval homes and sleeping arrangements. Many noble families, for example, would hang religious images or blessed symbols above their beds to ensure divine protection. These religious symbols could take the form of crucifixes, holy pictures, or relics of saints, all meant to ward off evil spirits and invite peace into the sleep space. For the poor, while they might not have had access to such lavish symbols, they often kept smaller, simpler religious items close to their beds, often just a simple cross or a prayer book, which they believed would keep them safe during the night. In many cases, the protection offered by these religious symbols wasn't just about warding off evil spirits or ensuring a peaceful night's sleep. It was also about finding comfort in times of uncertainty. Given the harshness of medieval life, where disease, famine, and violence were frequent concerns, sleep became a refuge, a time to let go of the anxieties of the day. The act of sleeping with faith and protection close at hand would have provided psychological comfort during times of crisis. Whether it was the constant threat of illness, the unpredictability of life, or simply the stress of daily survival, the idea that one was protected by God or by a saint would have been immensely reassuring. It's also worth noting that the Church's influence on sleep extended to how people viewed their sleep schedule. In many cases, people went to bed much earlier than we do today, aligning their sleep patterns with the natural rhythms of the sun. This wasn't just for health, it was also in accordance with the religious order of the day. The Church's influence on the schedule of daily life was profound, and the timing of sleep was part of that. Many medieval people followed a schedule that allowed them to rest for a few hours in the evening, waking early for morning prayers, work, and religious duties. Sleep was woven into the fabric of a daily routine that was defined by devotion and discipline. Historians continue to debate how much these religious practices affected the quality of sleep in medieval times. Was the devotion to prayer and religious rituals a form of mental peace that helped people sleep better? Or did the constant fear of supernatural forces make rest more difficult? It's hard to say for certain, but one thing is clear. The act of sleep was inextricably tied to faith, and the Church's influence permeated the way people rested. Ultimately, the religious aspects of sleep in the medieval world were more than just rituals or superstitions. They were a way to feel secure, to find peace, and to reaffirm the connection between the body, the soul, and God. While we might look back at these practices with curiosity or amusement, they were an essential part of how people approached sleep in the Middle Ages. For medieval people, sleep was a deeply spiritual act, a time to trust in divine protection and to reconnect with the eternal. As we approach the final stages of our journey through medieval sleep, it's time to discuss how the passage of time affected people's rest in a way we might not consider today. As society evolved, so did the sleep habits of the medieval world. What might have seemed like a perfectly functional sleep schedule for much of the Middle Ages began to change as the Renaissance approached and new ideas about time, productivity, and health began to take hold. As society grew more complex, with a burgeoning merchant class, shifting political powers, and the development of new technologies, sleep started to transform, often for the worse. One of the most significant changes to sleep came with the introduction of artificial lighting. For much of medieval history, people lived with the rhythms of natural light. They would rise with the sun, go to bed shortly after sunset, and sleep deeply through the darkness of the night. With no electric lights, the night was truly dark, and this darkness encouraged a more natural sleep cycle. But by the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, things began to change. As candles, torches, and later oil lamps became more common, people started staying up longer. No longer dependent on the natural light of the sun, people began to push their waking hours into the night, sacrificing the deep, uninterrupted rest that the pre-industrial world had known. The impact of artificial lighting on sleep was twofold. On one hand, it extended the hours available for socializing, working, and engaging in intellectual pursuits. But on the other hand, it disrupted the natural cycle of sleep, leading to poorer rest for many. With the invention of the printing press, for example, people began to read late into the night, often under dim candlelight or the flickering glow of a fire. This led to what we would now consider a form of sleep deprivation, as the body's natural circadian rhythms were ignored in favor of longer, more artificial waking hours. Historians still debate how much the introduction of artificial lighting truly disrupted sleep in medieval society. Was the sleep cycle of the late Middle Ages simply an adaptation to societal and technological change? Or did it have more serious consequences for people's health? What is clear, though, is that as light began to extend the hours of activity into the night, the natural rhythm of sleep began to erode. People didn't have the same uninterrupted rest they once did, and as the Renaissance led into the early modern period, sleep became more fragmented. Another important factor that changed medieval sleep habits was the development of more structured workdays. In medieval times, people worked in accordance with the seasons and the sunlight. Farmers worked during the day and rested at night, while craftsmen or merchants followed similar routines. But as the economy began to shift and cities became more industrialized, work hours became more rigid. For the emerging middle class, working long hours in a factory or shop became more common. This type of work demanded a more structured day, one that didn't always allow for the natural flow of sleep that people in earlier centuries had enjoyed. The rigid work hours of the new economy didn't just affect adults. As children began to work in factories or apprenticeships, their sleep schedules were affected too. For the first time in history, children's rest became subordinated to the need to contribute to the family's economic livelihood. This transformation had long-term consequences for sleep, as it marked the beginning of a shift away from natural rest toward sleep deprivation. The pursuit of economic productivity began to take precedence over individual health, and the natural rhythms of sleep suffered as a result. Perhaps one of the most notable shifts in medieval sleep came with the gradual decline of segmented sleep. As artificial lighting extended the waking hours and work became more structured, people no longer followed the pattern of segmented sleep. Rather than sleeping in two separate stretches, first sleep and second sleep, people started to sleep more continuously, often for longer stretches. This shift was gradual, but by the time of the Industrial Revolution, uninterrupted sleep had become the norm. This change, while seemingly minor, had profound effects on how people rested. The deep, restorative rest that medieval people experienced with their segmented sleep cycles was increasingly replaced by the continuous, but often more fragmented sleep patterns of modern society. This shift in sleep habits has been a point of interest for many historians and sleep scientists. Could segmented sleep have been healthier? Would it have led to deeper, more restorative rest? The consensus today seems to lean toward the idea that the segmented sleep pattern was a natural rhythm for the human body, and its decline might be contributing to the sleep problems we experience today. With the constant stream of light, information, and social interaction that now fills our days and nights, many of us have lost touch with the natural rhythms that governed sleep in medieval times. Could it be that the medieval sleep cycle, despite its discomforts and challenges, was more beneficial than the 8-hour stretch of uninterrupted rest that we strive for today? Some modern sleep experts believe that we could benefit from returning to a more natural, segmented sleep pattern, allowing ourselves to wake during the night, then return to sleep after a period of quiet time. This practice, rooted in the rhythms of the past, could potentially improve sleep quality and reduce the stress of trying to sleep straight through the night. However, in a world that demands continuous productivity, it's hard to see a return to these natural patterns anytime soon. We're conditioned to believe that uninterrupted sleep is the key to rest and health, but maybe, just maybe, medieval people had the right idea all along. Another shift that influenced sleep during this period was the growing emphasis on individual privacy. By the time the Renaissance rolled around, the medieval tradition of communal sleeping was starting to fade. The idea of having a private, individual bed became more common among the wealthy. And eventually, this desire for personal space in the bedroom trickled down to the middle class. This transformation in sleep spaces marked a departure from the close-knit communal rest that characterized medieval homes. As people started to sleep alone or in more private settings, the dynamics of sleep began to change. While privacy could have its benefits, it also meant that people were no longer benefiting from the warmth and emotional support that came with sharing sleep spaces. Historians still debate the impact of this shift. Was sleeping alone a more restful experience, or did it lead to a sense of isolation and anxiety? For many, the loss of communal sleep likely contributed to a more fragmented and disturbed sense of rest, as people were no longer able to rely on the comfort and security of being surrounded by family or even animals. As privacy became more valued, the emotional and social aspects of sleep started to disappear, leaving people with a more solitary, less restorative experience. The decline of medieval sleep habits didn't just mark the end of a particular way of resting, it reflected a larger shift in society. From the rise of artificial lighting to the rigid work schedules of the new economy, to the increasing emphasis on privacy and individualism, sleep in the Middle Ages began to evolve into something vastly different from what it had once been. The medieval world, with its segmented sleep and reliance on communal rest, may have had its challenges, but in many ways, it provided a much more natural and holistic approach to rest than the modern world. As we move forward in history, it's important to reflect on how the changes in our sleep patterns have affected our overall health, and whether returning to some of the old practices of the past might offer a path to better sleep in the future. As we approach the final part of our journey through medieval sleep, it's time to reflect on how we might learn from the past. The medieval sleep experience was marked by challenges, pests, cold, poor hygiene, and the constant threat of supernatural forces, but it also featured practices that could potentially benefit us in today's world. While the comforts we enjoy now, like soft pillows, temperature control, and clean sheets, make modern sleep far easier, the medieval approach to rest, despite its difficulties, had qualities we may want to reconsider as we seek better sleep in our own lives. One of the most striking aspects of medieval sleep is the idea of segmented sleep, the practice of sleeping in two distinct phases, first sleep and second sleep, allowed people to experience a natural rhythm that worked with their bodies. They would fall asleep soon after sunset, wake up in the middle of the night for an hour or so, and then return to sleep for a second period until dawn. This sleep pattern was deeply in tune with natural light and darkness, something we've lost in our modern, electrically lit world. Today, we tend to think that sleep must be continuous to be restorative, but modern research has shown that segmented sleep might have some benefits. Some sleep experts argue that waking up in the middle of the night isn't necessarily a problem, but rather part of the body's natural cycle. During those nighttime wakeful hours, people in the medieval world would often engage in quiet activities, reading, reflecting, or even praying, before returning to sleep. In fact, this waking period may have been an opportunity to rest the body and mind, rather than a disruption. It's not just that medieval people did this, it's that their bodies adapted to a sleep schedule that didn't demand an uninterrupted 8-hour block. Could modern society benefit from such a rhythm? In our quest to perfect sleep, we might do well to reconsider the segmented sleep pattern, particularly for those who struggle with insomnia or restless nights. Another aspect of medieval sleep that might be worth revisiting is the communal nature of rest. In medieval times, sleeping wasn't an isolated, private experience. Families, servants, and even animals shared the same spaces. While modern sleep tends to prioritize individual privacy, there could be emotional benefits to sleeping with others, whether it's a partner, family members, or even pets. The warmth and emotional comfort provided by those near us could help us feel more secure and relaxed, even as we sleep. It's easy to see how the communal sleep of the medieval world could have created a sense of safety and connectedness that promoted better rest. Could we, in a time of social isolation and growing stress, benefit from a return to shared spaces and warmth? Sleep rituals also played an important role in the medieval world. Prayers, blessings, and charms were used to protect against the fears of the night, whether it was nightmares, spirits, or just the anxiety of an uncertain world. While we may not believe in supernatural forces as medieval people did, the practice of winding down before sleep with a ritual, a prayer, or even a calming ritual of our own might help improve the quality of our rest. In a world full of distractions, taking a few moments to prepare for sleep, whether by reading a book, meditating, or practicing mindfulness, might provide the same sense of spiritual and emotional comfort that medieval people found in their nightly prayers. These rituals allowed them to enter a state of rest with peace in mind, and we could likely benefit from a similar practice. Finally, we can learn from the way medieval people lived in rhythm with the natural world. Without electricity and artificial light, they were more in tune with the sun's cycles, naturally rising and falling with the rhythm of the day. In today's world, we have become so detached from these natural cycles. Artificial light, blue screens, and late-night entertainment keep us awake long after the sun sets. Our bodies are still hardwired to respond to the natural light-dark cycles, and when we disrupt that rhythm, we often suffer the consequences: poor sleep, fatigue, and reduced energy. Maybe, just maybe, we need to reintroduce more natural light into our lives, cut back on artificial sources, and allow ourselves to fall in sync with the rhythms that nature has provided us for millennia. Could we, in today's world, return to a more natural sleep cycle? Could we benefit from embracing some of the practices of our medieval ancestors, like segmented sleep, communal rest, and nightly rituals? While we may never live exactly as they did, there are lessons to be learned from how they managed their rest, how they listened to their bodies, stayed connected with one another, and worked in harmony with the natural world. The challenges of medieval sleep were not insignificant, but they were also rooted in practices that aligned with the human body's natural needs. In contrast, our modern world has often ignored those rhythms in favor of efficiency and productivity. Perhaps in trying to optimize every aspect of our lives, we've lost something fundamental about the simple act of sleeping. As we close this journey, remember that the story of medieval sleep is one of adaptation, resilience, and wisdom in the face of difficulty. While they may have faced hardships, difficult beds, harsh climates, and pest-infested mattresses, medieval people still found ways to rest. In their sleep, there was a connection to something larger than themselves: nature, spirituality, community. And maybe, just maybe, we could recapture some of that sense of connection in our modern, busy world. Now, as you settle into your bed tonight, take a moment to appreciate the comfort you have, and perhaps reflect on the ways that medieval sleep, in all its imperfections, still offers us a glimpse into a more natural, connected way of resting. You've made it through the twists and turns of medieval sleep, exploring everything from the rituals and superstitions that guided the way people rested to the challenges they faced with temperature, pests, and hygiene. We've traveled through the centuries, examining how the practice of sleep has evolved, and perhaps how we can learn a few lessons from the past. As you drift off tonight, remember that while the conditions of medieval sleep were far from ideal, their approach to rest was deeply tied to the rhythms of the world around them. Whether it was their segmented sleep cycles or the comforting presence of others in the room, medieval people understood that sleep wasn't just about physical rest. It was about connection, protection, and the restoration of the soul. So, take a deep breath, relax, and embrace the rhythm of your own rest tonight. Just as medieval people once did, let your sleep be a time of rejuvenation, both for your body and your mind. Sleep well, and let the peaceful night guide you to sweet dreams.